The Center for New Eurasian Strategies, co-founded by Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2024, has released a new analytical report. Bild writes about this. The article notes Russia's high economic and political stability, which is why Vladimir Putin's regime currently faces no threat of imminent collapse. According to the publication Welt, citing the report, Western sanctions and street protests do not pose the Kremlin's primary threat. Experts cite the sudden illness or death of the president as the main risk to the system's stability. Furthermore, the potential end of the war could create certain difficulties for the Russian economy. A sharp reduction in military spending and the cessation of payments to combat veterans could impact the population's purchasing power and domestic consumption. William Alberk, a senior associate fellow at the Pacific Forum and security expert, told Channel 24 that the sudden death of the Kremlin leader could plunge Russia into chaos and provoke a civil war. According to him, the Russian political system is overly dependent on one person, so if he leaves, no one will be able to name a successor. As a result, various political groups, oligarchs, and security forces will engage in a fierce struggle for power, and certain influential figures may attempt to establish control over strategic assets, particularly the nuclear arsenal. Alberk believes that shifting the impact of the fighting to Russia is an effective strategy that gradually undermines support for the regime. He emphasizes, "I think that striking and shifting the costs of war onto the Russian people is an incredibly smart strategy. It increases the level of dissent within Russia." The expert doesn't predict mass protests or an imminent coup, noting that he doesn't yet see any signs of Putin's sudden removal from power. He cites the middle class, security forces, and wealthy residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg as the Kremlin regime's main supporters, not the poor. It is the deterioration in their quality of life, such as fuel shortages, that could be the most painful for the authorities. The protracted nature of the conflict is increasingly undermining the interests of the elites. As the analyst noted, many strategically minded people in Russia are genuinely wondering why this war has been going on for 4 years, is moving beyond that, and is heading into a 5th year, with no real end in sight. As evidence that Russia's stability has already been shaken, the expert recalled last year's march on Moscow by Wagner PMC organizer Yevgeny Prigozhin. But recall that Russia has operated under conditions of wartime mobilization. The political regime in Russia, a dictatorship with neo-totalitarian ambitions, has maintained relative stability. Through massive propaganda, the threat of repression against dissenters and the material benefits the war brings to parts of the elite and society, the government has secured a relatively high level of passive public support. Social tensions that have emerged so far have not posed a serious political challenge to the Kremlin. Despite the war and sanctions, the Russian economy has so far avoided a major crisis, although its problems are deepening. Russia continues to generate revenue from energy exports, which it has redirected from Europe to Asia. Economic cooperation with China plays a key stabilizing role in trade and public finances while supplying machinery, equipment, and technology, particularly for wartime production. Russia nevertheless faces numerous weaknesses in the political, social, and economic spheres. The rising costs of its armed aggression against Ukraine and the cumulative impact of Western sanctions are exacerbating these vulnerabilities. Negative trends in the economy and in society, both short-term and particularly long-term, are working against Russia. In the political sphere, growing centralization and personalization of power are reducing the system's effectiveness. Shrinking financial resources are intensifying competition within the elite. Opaque rules governing systemic corruption and the new redistribution of property, alongside weak mechanisms for elite renewal, are generating tensions and increasing unpredictability. A growing terrorist threat from Islamist radicals coincides with declining effectiveness in the security sector that has focused primarily on political repression. In the social sphere, public sentiment is deteriorating amid mounting socioeconomic challenges and a war-driven rise in the crime rate. Ethnic and religious tensions, xenophobia, and regional social inequalities are intensifying. War losses are exacerbating the demographic crisis. Failures of infrastructure are worsening, compounded by sanctions and technological and natural disasters. In the economic sphere, the combined effects of rising war costs and Western sanctions, along with adverse trends in commodity markets, are amplifying financial pressures. Inflation and high borrowing costs remain persistent challenges. The budget deficit remains high, social spending is declining in relative terms, and sectors not directly linked to defense production are contracting. Russia faces acute labor shortages. Economic dependence on China is increasing sharply, creating difficulties, including in the automotive industry, and generating political frictions. Technological regression is deepening beyond defense-related niches, and competitiveness is declining. Revenues from commodity exports are unstable, and Ukrainian strikes on refineries are disrupting the domestic fuel market. There is no indication that these issues will be resolved in the foreseeable future. On the contrary, they are likely to intensify. Nevertheless, the Russian regime does not intend to halt its systemic war against Ukraine and the West, and remains determined to continue it in one form or another. In the interests of the security of Western states and their partners targeted by Russian aggression, measures should be taken to exacerbate Russia's vulnerabilities. The short and medium-term objective should be to weaken Russia as much as possible and thus reduce its capacity to pursue aggressive policies. In the longer term, the aim should be to ensure Russia's defeat in the systemic war it has declared against Ukraine and the West. A regime change in Russia could facilitate such an outcome. First, Western policy should maximize support for Ukraine, particularly military assistance, in order to enable it to defend itself effectively and to inflict significant costs on Russia within its own territory. Effective Ukrainian strikes on military, energy, and other critical infrastructure deep inside Russia would not only generate serious economic challenges but also increase social and political tensions. They would complicate Kremlin propaganda, deepen divergences of interest between the center and the regions, within the elite, and among officials at different levels, thereby undermining confidence in victory and in the effectiveness of the policy of aggression. Second, it is essential to tighten the sanctions regime, both within Western states and institutions and in their relations with third countries, while also expanding existing restrictions. This would intensify Russia's economic problems, which would gradually translate into social and political pressures. Particular emphasis should be placed on targeting the foundations of Russia's revenue base, the oil, gas, and nuclear sectors. Western states should expand financial sanctions and fully scrap the oil price cap on Russian exports. A complete cessation of trade with Moscow is also necessary, as such trade constitutes one of the primary sources of funding for its war against the West. Customs systems should be strengthened to more effectively track and penalize sanctions evasion. Third, as Russia's cognitive war against the West becomes increasingly threatening, Western states and institutions should not only strengthen their internal resilience against Russian disinformation campaigns but also adopt a more proactive stance in the information domain. Media projects, including online platforms, particularly those run by independent Russian outlets operating from abroad, should receive robust support. By highlighting the numerous political, social, and economic challenges in Russia, they would gradually weaken the Putin regime. An important element of this policy should be support for the revival of national consciousness among the many nations and ethnic groups living within Russia that have fallen victim to Russian colonialism and Russification. These Western measures must not be confined to a short-term policy. It would be unrealistic to expect them to produce favorable change in Russia in the near term. What is required is recognition of the need for sustained, long-term strategic action. Only such a consistent policy, demonstrating Western strength and determination in the face of a confrontation imposed by Moscow, can lead to a future outcome that enhances security and stability,